Good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday. First of all, let me just apologize for the radio silence and not having been available. There's been a lot kind of going on. In brief, life happened. I have kids, one child finishing elementary school, so there's lots of emotional involvement and lots of activities there, and so that took up some of my time. My mom also had a partial mastectomy, although she had a benign papilloma. Still, there was some recovery associated with that. Our family went camping. I subsequently got an infection of my elbow, and I've had to be on antibiotics and such, and also got a little touch of poison ivy here. So it's just it's just been mayhem here. I apologize because I was taking on a commitment of trying to help people with a wellness journey, and although it's still fresh, I feel like it's a responsibility, and life happens, and when life happens, you just manage life and then get back on the horse. So again, I apologize. Wellness doesn't always mean perfect health, and I'm case in point. I was managing our bike rack, and it had a scratch on the bottom where it was ragged, and I scraped my knuckle, and the only thing I can figure is that some bacteria got in and seeded my elbow, so I then got what's called an olecranon bursitis, which means antibiotics and rest and that kind of thing. So anyway, and I'm rehabbing my microbiome as we speak. I'm trying to eat things like kraut and just lots of things with high fiber, staying on my keto diet with extra fiber to kind of feed the right bacteria, and taking a probiotic every day. I take Young Living's Life 9, and it's awesome. Okay, so let's get back to the ditch sugar. So in the first part, we talked about sugar and sugar alternatives, so that if you were trying to do a keto diet, you had some tools in the armamentarium to kind of go with. So we talked about erythritol versus monk fruit versus stevia, some of those alternatives, and how you can incorporate them in your diet. So I will say this, the conclusion I've kind of come to is that a keto diet is a great bridge to get you to the point where you can start to engage in intermittent fasting, which is kind of where a lot more of the real magic happens. But if you go from a carbohydrate dependent or a sugar dependent metabolism, like you're eating carbs every day, and then we suddenly throw you into fasting, you're gonna be miserable. You're gonna be so miserable because, first of all, your body's used to finding sugar. Without available sugar, you're gonna start having hypoglycemic type symptoms. And so your body is going to let you know, it's like, where's the sugar? Where are the carbs? We're not ready for this. And those symptoms of hypoglycemia are really miserable. I mean, you get shaky, you get sweaty, you get hangry, you get all those things. So you don't want to immediately try to do calorie reduction and fasting when you are on a solely or primarily carbohydrate metabolism. So keto is a great bridge for that. And if you can't do full keto, I would say using some of the sugar substitutes we talked about in the prior ditch sugar video, part 1, things like erythritol, I've baked with it some, and I will tell you this, overall your sweets are less sweet. With almond flour, you can approach the same texture, but the sweetness isn't going to be quite the same. And I think I said in that video, it's 60 to 70 times sugar. It's actually 60-70% as sweet as sugar. So it's still not going to be as sweet as sugar. One option could be that you could cut it. You could cut sugar with the erythritol, so you still get some of the sugar, but you have far less. So you have a reduced carb item versus all simple sugars and carbohydrates. So that would be an option to do. But keto is basically a bridge to get you to the point where you're on a fat burning metabolism, and then you use your own body's fat for fuel when you're not actively eating fat. So then you can go into the intermittent fasting type lifestyle, where there may be times where you're not eating quite as heavily, or you're eating certain calories that are kind of pre-selected, like a high protein load or a high fat load. And then you go into some fasting, even if it's just for 24 hours, which, again, if you ask somebody who is eating more carbohydrates, they're like, I could never do that. I would be miserable. And this is true. But when you get to a keto metabolism, an adaptive metabolism for burning fat, then it's far easier to do some of that intermittent fasting. And when you do that, it's kind of like, I was describing it to somebody the other day, your body goes into a state of, whoa, we've got limited resources, let's jettison the junk. And so it's kind of like defragging a hard drive. Your body engages in what's called autophagy, which is basically a fancy term for defragging the hard drive, getting rid of the junk. And then you'll end up making more growth hormone on the end of it, the other things that kind of will help you kind of clean up the clutter, so that you have a more efficient system and a healthier system is the goal. So, I mean, fasting's been around for centuries. People have done it for centuries, and there are health benefits associated with it, but it just doesn't ever seem achievable to most of us because we live in a society of food abundance. Now, I don't recommend this if you have any history of an eating disorder. That's a slippery slope. That's a whole different danger zone, I think. So I think if you're just interested in inducing weight loss and you're interested in getting overall healthier and you don't have a history of an eating disorder that would jeopardize your overall well-being, I think looking at the long view of possibly doing some intermittent fasting, it would be very helpful. And Walter Longo is one of the proponents for this out there. There's also Dominic D'Agostino that you can look at some of his resources for keto fasting. Dr. Mercola, who has a book called Keto Fast, has some of the strategies in there, and down the road we'll review those, but that's not a topic for today. So let's talk about number one, for ditch sugar. We talked about a keto calculator, and I wanted to get you on board with that. And so rather than try to screenshot it any other way, I'm just going to show you. I've got it up here on my computer. Okay, hold on. So this says ketocalculator.anchorroll.com. So when you go, make sure you got that, to that website, it's going to kind of walk you through a lot of things here. But one of the things it's going to talk to you about is putting in your weight, putting in your height. You kind of go through what's your normal activity level, how much body fat do you have, and estimate what percent, how many carbs can you eat every day, how much protein should you eat, how much fat should you eat, and then it kind of goes through, and it gives you at the bottom, this is a great thing, it says average deficit. This should be easily sustainable. It's a good choice for a start. So I would look and say, okay, of this, I would be choosing, about 1,400 calories. Maintenance would be 1,600 calories. I need a minimum of 30 fat grams. I really should be eating about 100 grams of fat. And it comes up with at the bottom a list of your macros, which you hear people talk about macros. They're meaning carbs, protein, and fat. So 30 grams of carbs, 90 grams of protein, and 100 grams of fat. And it even gives you a pie chart. Okay, so this is a great tool if you're a math person. I'm not a math person. I just eat keto-friendly foods all the time with a mix of paleo. I do the certain fruits, and I do complex carbohydrates, which are going to be found like the fibers in vegetables. Kraut would be an example, that kind of thing. So, so that's just something, if you want to kind of walk through that to figure out, I need to know exactly how much of each thing to eat, and I want to count each thing, since I've refer back to the read labels video that I did. Then I think that calculator, for me, it seems like it's the easiest to navigate, and I've enjoyed it the most in terms of just usability. Okay, so it'll tell you how many carbs, and then you go read your labels if it's a box, and then you say it's too many carbs. Most other natural foods, it's easy to find out how many carbs are in those kind of servings. You just go, Google it, look up a calculator and find out how many carbs are in, say, a cup of blueberries, or how many carbs are in, 10 strawberries. That's pretty easy to do if you want to count those. Okay, and I will be attaching a graphic, hopefully, at the bottom of this that shows you keto-friendly foods. That's something I haven't done yet. So the goal is to stay in a state of mild ketosis, because that's where you get the maximal benefit. You don't want to be so ketotic that you're miserable. You need to drink plenty of fluids so you don't become acidotic as well, and that's more likely to be prone in somebody who is potentially a type 1 diabetic if their blood sugars are too high. That's a whole different physiology. So if you're just doing plain ketosis, mild ketosis, it will suppress your hunger hormones, and it will also increase your satiety hormones in the long run. So extreme ketosis is not the goal. That's not what you don't want. Starvation. You just want your body, you want to trick your body. So Hunger hormones. The one that, if the easiest way to remember this I've discovered is leptin means less. Leptin is your satisfied and I don't need to eat any more hormone. Ghrelin, which is GHRELIN, is the grow hormone. That's the one that tells you you're hungry, you need to eat more. So think of ghrelin as grow, leptin is less. So when you have high leptin levels, you're eating less, you feel satisfied. Those are the hormones that tend to get impacted with being in a ketotic state and actually make you kind of affect your overall hunger drive. Okay, now let's talk about sugar and why it's toxic. This is one of those basic kind of concepts. So the term glycation means you have a sugar molecule attached to something, okay? Glycation. So when you go to your doctor, if they tell you that they've checked a hemoglobin A1C, they are telling you how much of your red blood cells are floating around in your bloodstream with a sugar attached. It's an index. Ideally, you want it to be below 5, like 5.2, I think is the threshold that most people are aiming for. At one point, mine was 5.8. And I have a family of family history of type 2 diabetes, and certainly I was like, oh, I don't want to be courting that. So knowing that my hemoglobin A1C was 5.8, I knew I needed to make some dietary changes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But anytime it has a sugar molecule attached, then your hemoglobin, obviously, its ability to do its normal functions could be compromised. You know, it normally carries oxygen, and that's supposed to carry oxygen to your tissues, offload it, you know, different things. It's pretty complex, actually. We're fearfully and wonderfully made in that sense. But think about how it probably isn't going to be doing its job very well if it's got all this sugar attached to it that it's carrying around as well. So if you need motivation for why sugar is toxic, think about the fact that just the very job of carrying oxygen is important, and your hemoglobin can't do it when it has it's like carrying around extra weight. So when you glycate things, when things are glycated and have sugar attached to them, then they're prone to oxidation. And when you have oxidation, which is you get this chemical conversion and oxygen gets involved, then you have the formation of free radicals, and that's when you get damage and inflammation. So one step leads to the next step, the next step, the next step. So glycation, attachment of sugar, then you get oxidation and oxidative stress, which is bad for you and ages you. And then you get free radical formation, which causes damage to the cells, DNA, RNA, all that. And then you get inflammation in that area. So inflammation is the biggest thing we want to avoid. And I will tell you right now, when I went onto a keto diet, my inflammatory markers nosedived. They were far too high before, and when I went back and had them checked, they had normalized, and I was healthier. I didn't have allergies. I had lost weight. I had lost visceral weight, which was the belly fat that was the abdominal fat that was giving me grief. So just keep in mind, a keto diet will take you on the pathway of less inflammation because you have less sugar, you have less carbs in your bloodstream and in your system, therefore preventing this inflammatory damage. So sugar is toxic for that very reason as well. Keep in mind, when your blood levels of something go up, it means that that metabolic system has been overwhelmed for whatever reason. And one of the most notorious ones is going to be fructose. So we're going to talk about that, how that's... fructose is normally the sugar that is found in fruits, you know, fructose, fruit. What we see now in our food supply is high fructose corn syrup. So it's derived from corn. It's not natural, like from strawberries or blueberries. It's stripped of any fiber. It's stripped of any of the antioxidant potentials that used to be in there. So when you look at a whole food, a healthy food, even though it may be fruit and it may have fruit sugars in it, even honey has fructose. The question is, what else is in it to benefit you? Because if you don't get any other natural substances in there to benefit you, then it's stripped of anything that's beneficial, and then it's purely becomes sugar, which is what you have in the case of high fructose corn syrup. So refer back to a prior video of read labels. Read your labels. If it has high fructose corn syrup in it, you just need to keep going. And unfortunately, it's in everything. Anything that has a stable shelf life, anything commercial often has high fructose corn syrup. It's just bad for you. So let's talk about the reasons why. It's been implicated in irritable bowel syndrome because it has a role when it comes to inflammation. So if you have IBS, one of the first things you really want to consider is getting rid of high fructose corn syrup. Not only rehabbing your gut flora, but also getting rid of high fructose corn syrup in your diet, because that could be one of the problems. Here's part of the reason why. High fructose corn syrup, because it has such a high level of fructose, it's primarily processed in the liver. The liver's like, okay, we got so much of this going on. What do we do with it? We detoxify stuff. That's what the liver's job is to do. So let's get going, let's get it. But keep in mind, it's far more concentrated than what you would get in a natural source like a fruit. And so your system gets overwhelmed. So you get a lot of inflammation of your hepatocytes, which are your liver cells. And then you also get inflammation in your peripheral fat cells, what we call your sub-Q adipocytes. So not only the liver's inflamed, but also your abdominal fat and the fat cells in your skin also get inflamed. So keep in mind, when you think high fructose corn syrup, it's a non-food. It doesn't have any benefit to you whatsoever. It's basically just like a syrupy sugar that's a non-food. So we know it has a role in fatty liver. So when you hear the word fatty liver, that doesn't mean eat low fat. I think that's always been a misnomer. I wish they'd never named it fatty liver. They did that because they saw all this fat deposition, all this fat that was stuck in all these liver cells, and so they called it fatty liver. But that would imply that fat is the reason and the cause, and that's not true. We're finding now that a lot of that is sugar metabolism, primarily fructose. So when you get a fatty liver, the first thing you want to do is cut out sugar in your diet, because when you do that, you can get some reversal of that before you have scarring and damage of the liver. So remember, fructose is not your friend. So this inflammation of those hepatocytes and also the fat cells in the skin and the abdominal fat causes a release of cortisol because of all the local inflammation. So the cell makes cortisol to kind of calm down the inflammation. When it does, then you get increased insulin that gets secreted, so therefore you have more storage of calories as fat. So then you get on the road to insulin resistance. You get more abdominal fat, and then you also have high blood sugar levels when you have more cortisol around. So all of that kind of goes together with this whole inflammatory cascade, which then perpetuates itself, right? So the way to break it is just not have the key driver in that, which is the fructose. Now, let's talk real quickly about, so we talked about ditching sugar, we talked about fructose, why it's bad for you, why sugar in general is bad for you, why glycation is bad, fructose-induced inflammation, that sort of thing. Let's talk about its role with your gut microbiome. So your gut microbiome is crucial. They're discovering now it's like a whole different part of science. But when you feed certain bacteria downstream with the wrong things, then you get the wrong bacteria growing, right? So for instance, for me, I've been on antibiotics, trying to nurse this baby here. I've had to take Keflex. So one of the things I'm wanting to do is making sure I'm keeping up the healthy bacteria so I don't get antibiotic-associated diarrhea or antibiotic-associated anything. So keep in mind, sugar is also a substrate for your bacteria. It's what they use. They can break it down to make fuel, but they also will make gas. That's not good for you. And then your microbiome is important because it helps you absorb nutrients. It helps break down all those complex carbohydrates, which are good for you. And you can do complex carbohydrates on a keto diet within, limitations, because that helps your gut bacteria make the right things like short chain fatty acids, which then your brain can use for fuel and your liver can use for fuel and all that stuff. So your gut microbiome is important because it helps make neurotransmitters like serotonin, which help with your sense of well-being. And so that helps you just feel your brain feel better. No serotonin, not happy. So we're finding now that artificial sweeteners, so not things like I talked about before, monk food, erythritol, stevia, those kind of things. Artificial sweeteners actually are toxic to some of the good bacteria in your microbiome too. So that's super important. So I think that's enough for today when you talk about sugar and toxicity. The next thing we're going to talk about is keto keto-friendly options for fuel too, because ketone bodies are really, really good source for fuel. And so there's certain things I did to kind of kickstart my keto weight loss. One of them was brain octane oil, which is made by bulletproof.com. And we'll talk about why and how that works so well for inducing keto. So we talked about sugar alternatives to help your sweet tooth. Now we're talking about why sugar is bad for you. If you needed any motivation not to eat high fructose corn syrup, say that 5 times fast, or sugar, think of it as poison. It's going to cause inflammation. And we now know that so many diseases, chronic diseases that are not part of the wellness picture. We're talking heart disease, heart failure, we're talking diabetes, we're talking cancer. So many of those are going to have a metabolic root cause. And that metabolic root cause is going to be tied back to sugar consumption, simple carbohydrate, refined carbohydrate consumption. So if you needed any motivation, just remember sugar is poison. Period. It just is. It's not good for you. There's so many other things you can't eat that are good for you. And you need to focus on those because they will promote health and well-being and wellness. And once you do it and you make that mindset, that shift of, I'm not going to eat that because it's kind of like poison, then everything changes. Everything changes for you. So I wish you luck, and we'll do Ditch Sugar Part 3 hopefully tomorrow or the next day. But I apologize for the absence and promise not to do it again. Have a great day. Happy Thursday.